So, hi everyone, and welcome to today's seminar that is hosted by the International Inequality Institute at the LSE. I'm Pedro, research fellow at the III, as you know. I'm very pleased to be here in today's seminar, which the title is here, right? Patrons, Protégés. What's the word for that, please?
Yeah, good. Protégés.
Protégés and peers, workplace mechanisms of intergenerational inequality. Today we have parents. That is Associate Professor of Sociology at the UCL in the Social Research Institute and the Swedish Institute of Social Research at the Stockholm University, and is also Associate Member of the Notfield College at Oxford. As usual, you know that there will be a chance for you to pose questions following the presentations. And of course, we'll also take questions from both in-person and on the online audience. So I will then hand over to Pia. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thanks for having me. It's a great honor to be here. Can people online hear me? I assume they can. When I was invited to present something here, I thought this is great because I'm just now this month I started my research league to launch a European grant, and I very boldly assumed that I would have like the first paper from that project, and then, as always, our aims are a bit loftier than what we sometimes achieve. So I will present the sort of mix of a paper that this project builds on, that I've been working on for the last 5 years, that is just accepted and coming out, as well as some newer, more experimental results. I will, however, focus on some of the kind of more recent results. So if there's anyone that's heard a version of this presented before, I'll try to focus more on stuff that I haven't kind of foregrounded earlier when I'm presenting this. But I don't see too many familiar faces in the audience, so this is actually great. I get to repeat myself. Anyway, I'm gonna start off with the observation that in any society we know, people parents who have jobs that give them higher pay, prestige, or power tend to have children who are also much more likely to go on and fill those same kind of positions. So this is just a recent example from popular news media, so-called Nepo babies in Hollywood, actors, singers, directors who just happen to be the children of actors, singers, directors, as the New York Magazine here puts it. Is this a problem? Is this something that we should be concerned about? Well, according to Maya Hawke, the daughter of famous actors Uma Thurman and Ethan Hawke, she says, nepotism is fine. I'm comfortable with not deserving it and doing it anyway. Probably for the most of the rest of us, however, feel at least a slight sense of discomfort. We feel that there is some norm of fairness, of equality, opportunity that is being violated.
You're jealous. Maybe we have jealous.
Sorry?
Maybe we have jealous.
Yeah. Well, that's another question. So I want to save this for a moment because use this example not just to grab your attention, but actually to highlight some shortcomings in how this question has been studied, particularly in sociology, which is my field, but perhaps also in economics, which I draw heavily on. So when sociologists have been studying this question of intergenerational persistence over the last century, and I'm not exaggerating, it really goes back that far, we have predominantly tended to focus on the inheritance of occupations, of staying in the same broad occupational class as your parent, so white collar versus blue collar and so on, or inheriting the very same occupation. Now, Maya Hawke kind of is a neat illustration of the fact that things are often more complicated. So her parents are incredibly successful actors, right? But she's mainly making her career in Hollywood as a singer. So if we classified her by occupation, she would be occasionally mobile. But she's also clearly benefiting from her parents in some wider sense, from their name recognition, from their kind of industrial know-how, or from social contacts, perhaps. So that's something that we're not really picking up in sort of our conventional models of status persistence. The other point that I want to highlight is that these aren't just any actors, singers, directors. They are specifically people who are in a position to do what they do and make a fortune doing it, right? So it's a very different being a Hollywood actor or being an actor who records workplace safety demonstration videos. And then this brings me to the third point, which is that often where you work, who your employer is just as important as what skills or talents you bring or the kind of work you do. So I think all of these points have been sort of underappreciated in this general field of scholarship. So for the first half of this talk, or first half hour, I'm going to talk about this paper that is just accepted and is coming out in the American Journal of Sociology. It's joint work with my co-author Nathan Wilmers, who's based at MIT. And then I will sort of launch into my wider research agenda, which is captured in this ERC starting grant that I'm just launching, and I'll show some early results from that are building off what we do in this paper. Okay, so just to sort of repeat what I just said, but perhaps in a slightly more academic way. So when people have been studying intergenerational persistence, whether it's in sociology or whether it's in economics, we typically have in mind an association between what we in sociology call origin and destination, O&D. So that if you're a sociologist, is typically the occupational status of the parent and the child. In economics, you would more typically be looking at income. And then when people have been trying to explain this association, what they mostly have been focusing on is human capital, education as the fundamental mediating variable. So in sociology, we call this the OED model. In economics, you have the Becker-Tomes model to the same effect, right? But the intuition is the same, which is that parents, well-positioned, higher-earning parents, have the means and ability to invest in their children's human capital. The children's human capital then go on to pay a competitive return in a competitive labor market. However, if we are interested in equality of opportunity or fairness, a lot of the kind of mechanisms that we should be focusing on are things that happen over and above the productivity enhancing traits that you bring to the labor market, let's say. And this is something that we almost without exception just treat as a complete black box, treat as a residual, whatever remains once we have controlled for a reasonably extensive set of human capital characteristics. So in this paper, we kind of ask what happens if we turn this on its head and start from the labor market, the social context that the individual is situated in, instead of what individual characteristic he or she brings to the labor market. The way to do this, we argue, is by using linked employer-employee data. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. This is just a sort of schematic illustration of what we can do with this kind of data. So in this case, we have individuals nested within firms or employers, and we follow them over time. So each year we observe where they are working, how much they earn. So in this case, individual I starts out in firm 1, then transitioning to firm 2, does a brief stint in firm 3 before eventually settling back in firm 2 long term. So once you do this for a large enough number of individuals, ideally for a whole population, and for a large enough number of years, a pattern starts to emerge. And that is that some individuals are consistently paid more, no matter where they happen to be working. That's the one side. But on the other side, there's also the fact that some employers consistently pay more or less for the same kind of work, no matter the composition of workers they happen to be employing at the same at a given time. And linked employer-employee data very neatly allows you to tease out these two dimensions in what is called an AKM decomposition after Abo, Cremart, and Margolis. Famous paper from 1999. So this has been more and more commonly applied to especially administrative data in different countries. In this paper, we use registered data from Sweden, and that's pretty unique in that we have this type of linked employee data covering a period of 30 years. So that actually means that we can capture both parents and children at a reasonably mature age. What I'm showing you here is going to be based on labor income, so earnings, and I transform that to percentile ranks relative to people of your same birth cohort, gender, and year. We've done everything with log earnings, it looks the same. I don't have like a deep justification of this other than that rank is kind of more commonly used in the mobility literature, in the inequality literature, log earnings would have been more common, but it works out the same way no matter what you use. So then we fit this kind of two-way fixed effect model. We have separate intercept for workers and for firms. I tend to say firms, but this is actually includes the public sector as well. So it's a broader set of employers, not just firms necessarily, but I'll be referring to firms just to be consistent with the wider literature. And also what I show you today is looking at fathers and sons. So of course, we've done everything for any combination of mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. Patterns are just very similar, so we don't find a strong gender story there. Another thing to mention is that, yeah, this worker component also, it includes individual intercepts. It also includes controls for a set of potentially time varying things like education, that we also interact with the individual's gender and age to kind of soak up as much as we can of individual characteristics that are predictive of earnings and take that out into the equation to focus on this firm component that reflects that some firms pay more or less for the same or similar kind of work. In terms of the cohorts that we cover in this paper, so as I said, we have linked employee data from 1990s onward, and we impose a set of cohort restrictions just to kind of know that we measure income at reasonable ages. So we focus on fathers born in the 1940s and 50s, a set of cohorts of children born in the late 70s, and that means that we can measure father income as a 10-year average somewhere between age 30 to 60, and child income is measured earlier in the career, 25 to 40. Actually, what I will show you today is just earnings as a 5-year average centered on age 45, so the average earnings between ages 38 to 42. Any questions so far, or are we all good? All good, okay. Just feel free to interject at any point otherwise. Okay, so the first finding is that, surprise, surprise, where you work matters. So this is showing you on the horizontal axis, the father's earnings rank measured as a 10-year average around those ages, 30-60, as I was showing you. The vertical axis shows you at each percentile in the father earnings distribution, what is the percentile rank of the son's individual component of earnings, so those are the red dots, and the rank of the pay premium of the firm for which the son is working. So you can see that each of these is kind of linearly consistently related to father earnings. We kind of jump through a set of different additional steps to put a figure on exactly how much of the total intergenerational earnings correlation this accounts for, and it turns out that sorting across firms or employers accounts for 28% of the total earnings correlation. Once we use establishments, so workplaces rather than firms, the figure is even higher. So that's 40% of the earnings correlation father to son is explained by sorting across establishments. Yeah.
So the little white dots are the size that you had in the previous. They are the size that you had. In the
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And what's in the X again?
Yeah. So X is individual. We've done it a bunch of different ways. X is the individual intercept, and then it's 4 levels of education interacted with gender and age. It looks the same if we have, instead of individual intercept, we have an individual intercept and slope. that is unique to each individual. It looks the same if we control for up to 100 different levels of education, or if we control for very detailed fields of study. Most of the differences between individuals is going to be soaked up by these intercepts anyway. But the reason why we use education interacted with age and gender is that people have a different earnings profile and not just a level of earnings, right?
And I think you said this, but I missed. So the size in the graph there averages over.
Yeah, so that's another very good point. So that kind of assumes that these pay premiums are constant over time for each firm, and that is a strong assumption. What we've done is we've broken it up in 5-year spans. So we reassign firm IDs every 5 years, and we find very similar results, which I initially thought was puzzling, but it turns out that these firm IDs aren't very long-lived. So even in the case of a firm that exists kind of throughout this period, for various administrative reasons, they tend to get assigned a new ID. Once there is a merger or an acquisition or something, a new ID is created. So there's actually quite a high turnover of firms, and that means that it doesn't really matter for our results whether we break it up or whether we have one.
How a firm changes movements across firms like the ones you showed in the initial graph dealt with in the construction of that graph that you have?
So this is potentially, so this is showing you the average over the ages 38 to 42. So potentially I could be working for 5 different employers. In that case, it's taking the firm premium of each of those employers and averaging. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so far so good. So another way to slice this is, let me put it this way. So I don't know what you think, but this number kind of strikes me as relatively large. So a third or 2/5 of earnings transmission is due to something that basically in this field of research or as policymakers, we haven't thought much about at all. Like all kind of policy interventions to equalize opportunity, they tend to be directed towards what happens in education and not so much what happens in labor market. So I think this is potentially huge. It opens up a whole new area to think about how we can make opportunity more equal. Now, one crucial assumption underlying that claim is that workers who come from different social background, they derive the same boost to their earnings for working for a high premium firm. So that is an assumption, but that's an assumption that we can test. And here you see on the horizontal axis, the father earnings rank. Again, on the vertical axis is the son's earning rank, so no longer separating the firm and the individual component, but showing you the association between father and son earnings at 4 different quartiles of the firm pay premium. So the quarter who works for the lowest paying firms, the next quarter, next quarter, and so on, up until the highest paying quarter of firms. And you can see just the difference here in working for a bottom quartile and a top quartile firm is huge. It's 20 percentile points, a difference for your earnings. Now, I should say that this includes selection. So not all of it is causal. It's also about who goes to work at these firms. But nevertheless, it's a very striking gap. And you can also see that these lines are roughly parallel. So it does seem that no matter where you start out in your father's earnings distribution, working for a high or low paying firm seems to imply roughly the same benefit or the same penalty. So the fact that this explains so much of intergenerational earnings transmission is rather due to the fact that these firms recruit from very different points in the father earnings distribution. So if you come from a high earnings background, you're just way more likely to work for a high paying firm. And vice versa, if you come from a low earning background, you're much more likely to work for a low paying firm.
And again, you're doing this averaging over the entire lifetime for which you observe the individual.
So for 10 years for the fathers and 5 years for around age 40 for the sons.
Do you have the information of where they start? In which firm?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not showing you this today, but in the paper, we kind of do this analysis for each year from age 25 to 40. And I don't know if you have a specific question in mind.
What I had in mind is whether high earning fathers make it easier to move to high paying firms.
Yeah.
We can come back to this at the
Let
end.
me come back to that and see if my answer satisfies you. I want to highlight something else first, and that is something that we added at a relatively late stage in this manuscript, but I think it's important, and that is the question of where do these paid premiums come from? Why is it that some employers pay more than others? And I think this is something that is generally quite under-theorized. I couldn't find a lot of work on it, either in economics or sociology or any other field. So the way that we tend to think of this as sociologists is that these firm premiums are the result of two processes of what we call social closure. So first of all, how profitable a firm is depends on their ability to increase and maintain market shares, to kind of find a market niche and close themselves off from competition. That allows them to raise profit, but then given a certain size of the pie, as it were, firms also differ in the amount of profit that gets redistributed, gets passed through to workers in the form of salaries and other benefits. So that is the second process. So the first one is, okay, how much does the firm, how much revenue does the firm raise, and how much of that is passed on to workers? And in the Swedish Company Register, we have data on value added per worker that allows us to tease out these two dimensions. So the size of the pie that a firm has to pay out to workers or other stakeholders, and the proportion of that actually reaches the worker. So we construct two different firm rankings, and we see that both of these processes in almost exactly equal part account for this advantage that sons from high earnings background have. So if you come from a higher earnings background, you're likely to both find work with a firm that is higher profit and that pass through a higher share of their surplus to workers. Okay, so I want to get to the point that you raised. Let me not spend too much time on this, but just to say, in terms of how this fits into what I was showing earlier here, a question that always comes up is like, okay, so maybe firms or employers matter, but isn't this just educational stratification in disguise? Or isn't this just about occupations? So that's a very fair kind of objection. So we do a quite detailed job, I would say, to see exactly how these different components overlap with things like education and occupation, both education as level of education, but also as detailed educational fields. And basically the takeaway here is that sorting across firms explains much more of the part that is not mediated via occupation or education. So it explains about half of this direct association in earning, the OD given E, that remains once you control for either education or for occupation. Whereas it explains a much smaller part of pay differences by education or occupation, what we might call returns in a very loose observational sense to education and occupation.
Not sure I get this.
No, sorry.
For firm sorting by.
Yeah, okay.
By what?
So let me walk through exactly what this shows. So this is using very detailed classifications of education and occupation that we have in the register data, so generally 3 or 4 digit level. again, we're studying earnings rank. And basically what I'm doing is I'm predicting your earnings from education, occupation, or the combination of the two, and then correlate that with the actual earnings. So that's the blue bars. So that gives you a measure of the extent to which differences in earnings are explained by education and occupation. And then I control for your firm pay premium and see how much of the observational returns to education and occupation are explained by firm sorting. And then we see that that is generally about a fifth of the observational returns to education and occupation are firm sorting. This, on the other hand, is the residual correlation between the father and son earnings. Once you control for education, occupation, or both, and we see that in that case, up to half or more is explained by firm sorting. So it does seem that this sorting across employers, across firms, kind of taps into a separate dimension that isn't completely related to education and occupation, which are the main kind of mechanisms of education that we've been studying earlier. And I can't enough emphasize how rare and exciting this is as a social scientist to have something that we've treated as a residual, as a complete black box, and suddenly be able to explain half of that, right? So this direct effect of social origin is where we, in the past, we've thrown up our hands in the air and say, well, you know, education explains a lot, but not all of it. We don't know what the rest is. Actually, we know what half of that residual is now, which is pretty big.
Can I just ask
Yeah.
about this residual and then
Sure.
send me to the end? If you
Yeah,
have a
absolutely.
general.
No, I'm happy to take questions.
You're not controlling for location.
Not here, no.
So part of the difference could be that I am a lawyer born to a lawyer in London and I'm working
Absolutely.
for a corporate law firm in London rather than a family
Yeah.
law firm in.
But I will show you how much that explains in a couple of slides. The other thing is that I'm not. This also, as you probably have understood by now, it also reflects differences by industry, by sector. Right, so in economics, when people estimate these firm premiums, they sometimes look at the residual that remains once you take out industry differences and so on. Here, that is baked into the pay premium, but I'll show you exactly how much that explains. It's not the main mechanism. Do you have a question?
Again, if it's slowing you down, just.
No, go for it.
But, I mean, in a sense, there's two kind of models of what the firm could do, right? One is selection.
Yeah.
So it's all about the
Yeah.
fact that bigger law firms will get all the best graduates
Yeah.
from Harvard and they
Yeah,
go there, or,
absolutely.
you know, UCL will hire the
Yeah.
best sociologists
Yeah.
and they will go somewhere else. And the other is that there's actually something about the firm, either it's capital stock or it's management or some feature of the firm that enters into the production
Yeah,
function
absolutely.
directly
Yeah.
and is not to do with a. Now, I don't know if you're trying to capture conceptually whether you're interested in this distinction.
I am. I will
whether
show
you're
you.
trying
Yeah, I
to-
will show you estimates of how much it is selection.
Because if it's select, then the question becomes, if it's select, the game would then become, at least in my mind.
Yeah.
To sort of expand that vector X, right, as much as possible and include things like IQ and include.
Absolutely.
Which university you went to, not just that you went to
Yeah.
university. You know, did you graduate? And somebody was telling me the other day that some law firm just hires people if they came out of the top quarter
Yeah.
of the distribution
Yeah.
of Harvard Law
Yeah.
School. You know, so all of
Yeah.
these things, then, you know, and I don't know, and Swedish data is wonderful. So maybe you have half of them there, maybe not. You know.
Absolutely. No, I mean, that's a very good point. So I mean, I will show you, we estimate that actually 3/4 of this kind of goes away once you control for selection. There's actually some related work in economics that claims that that share is lower, that it's about half. And half of it is actually a causal effect. I would say though, that even if it is selection on education, let's say, it suggests that education is important. We already knew that, but it suggests a slightly different interpretation on why education is important. We tend to be very quick to jump to the conclusion that education is human capital. It captures, you know, skills and other productivity enhancing traits. But I would point to a different interpretation, which says that education is also something that positions you for getting employment with this high paying employment. And we can't really assume that education is solely reflecting the individual's human capital. That would be my reply. But I'll show you what we do about it, and then we can argue about it. But I want to get to your question, which was, does your father actually help you get a job in these firms? So one thing that is neat about the administrative data that we have is that not only do we know who is every employer that you ever worked for, who is every employer that your father or mother ever worked for, but we can also go on to ask questions like, who is every colleague that your father has at some point worked with in the past? And that allows us to create a sense of the social contact network that your father in this case has that might help you to get a leg up in the labor market. So the way we do this is we look at both how common it is that you start working in the same firm as your father. So that's what we refer to as direct referral. And then how common it is that you work with someone, that you find work in a firm with someone who was at one point in the past a co-worker of your father. Now, there's going to be a lot of overlap just by coincidence or structural location, right? So perhaps you grew up in a small town, there is only one big plant that employs everyone. It's going to look like your father found you a job even if he didn't. So we also construct a set of placebo links, and they consist of people who at some point worked in a firm where your father worked, but there was no overlap in time. Or they worked with your father in the same firm at the same time, and they are now your coworker, but they entered your firm after you came in. So they couldn't have helped you get a job there. And those are the placebo hires. So we see these placebo links, reassuringly, are entirely unrelated to where you are in the father's earnings distribution. But working in the same firm of your father, or plausibly finding a job through a social contact of your father, that is much more common in the upper half of the father earnings distribution. And then to say how much this explains the intergenerational earnings persistence, we do something very simple. So we take, if you think back to that bin scatter plot, the very first one that I was showing you earlier that has father's earnings ranked and your firm pay premium. We take the slope of that regression line, and we ask how much flatter is that line for those who never experience a direct or indirect referral, and how much steeper is it for those who do experience a direct and indirect referral. So if you find work through your father or father's former colleague, that correlation between your father's earnings and your firm pay premium is higher, so it's 0.15 on average. In this population is about 0.20, either for direct or indirect referral, and for those who don't experience either of those, it's lower, so about 0.13, 0.14. So this explains a little bit, but maybe not a huge deal. On the other hand, there's a lot about social networks that we're not capturing here, so arguably this is kind of a lower bound. Interestingly, we see the same results when we look at the individual earnings rank, so your kind of long-term earnings across all employers. So that could suggest two things. Either firms use social networks to hire the most competent workers, and that is correlated with your social background. Or it could reflect that if you're hired through social contacts, not just does that help you get a job with a higher earning employer, but it actually increases your earnings rank with that employer as well as with subsequent employers. So you kind of use these contacts to get a stepping stone in the labor market that then kind of gives a lasting boost to your earnings. I see a question.
It's just a clarification question. So you were saying when you were presenting the equation that you were also including public sector as a firm, and I'm wondering whether the public sector is here, because then having your father, I mean, at least in some countries, if you're a public employee, then it means you took an exam. So I guess this channel of having someone inside, it's technically weaker. So does this include people working in the public sector?
So you say that we would expect this to be stronger in the private sector than the public
Exactly,
sector?
and whether you're mixing both.
Yeah, this includes all of them. I actually, there is a Swedish working paper showing that this type of thing is surprisingly common among public servants as well. And of course, you can't distinguish whether that's nepotism or whether it's something else. No, this includes all workers, but I wouldn't necessarily assume that it's much weaker in the public sector. Okay. Okay, so what happens if we bring all of these explanations, including human capital together? So this is just showing you kind of stepwise regression. Of course, the relative explanatory power of these things depends on the sequence in which we introduce them. But in this case, they're not very strongly correlated. So the results are actually very similar, no matter what sequence we measure these things. So in the first column, again, is just showing you the raw correlation between your father's earnings and your firm pay premium at age 40. And that correlation is 0.50. Once we control for very detailed measures of education, occupation, as well as the worker component from this fixed effect decomposition. So this, again, captures everything that consistently gives you a higher reward in the labor market. So it's a very comprehensive control for human capital, but it also includes other things. So if there is persistent discrimination, if there is class discrimination across all employers, for example, that would end up here. So again, arguably, perhaps an over control, but these things together explain 2/3. Sorry, I think I said 3/4 earlier, but 2/3 of that firm sorting coefficient is explained by education, occupation, and the worker fixed effects. These referral mechanisms, as we observe them, and then another set of covariates that I haven't really talked about, they each explain most of, or together explain most of the remaining part. So these other things that I haven't gone into detail with are the effect of, as you asked, staying in the same local labor market as your father, staying in the same one-digit industry, and staying in the same firm long-term. So these things actually explain surprisingly little. And this is striking because often when I present this, people think the first thing on their mind is the inheritance of a family business, right? They expect to account for quite a large part of this firm premium. But that is a vanishingly small mechanism. And that also highlights that then these referral mechanisms aren't really, so the referral measures are defined as working in your father's firm or for a former colleague of your father at any time throughout ages 25 to 40. Whereas here we look at whether your main employer around age 40 is the same as your father's main employer. Now that's very rare, and it explains for it accounts for very little. Okay, I want to use the few minutes that I have left to talk a little bit about research agenda and some early results. Good. I should also flag that there are a couple of working papers in economics that are very similar to what we do. So one by Dobbin and Zohar, that's R&R at AJ Applied right now. They use Israeli data. Now, they differ in various respects. So both of these papers study the earnings elasticity, not the rank correlation. So that's the first difference. The Israeli paper, they find that 22% of that intergenerational elasticity is accounted for by firm sorting, but that's only firm sorting on the child side. Don't look at parents' firm sorting. Interestingly, actually, with the proportion that's explained by sorting in that firm coefficient, they put a lower number on it. So they say that only half of it is sorting, whereas we say it's 2/3. And arguably their method is more sophisticated. And then there's a similar paper on Sweden that finds quite similar results. They find a higher figure. So they say that 30 or 30 up to 38% of the earnings elasticity is actually firm sorting. Okay, so My ERC project, which started this month, is a kind of extension of this work, where what I've showed you so far is all about sorting across employers. And I want to address two other issues with this project. One of them being inequality within working places, so what happens within employers and not just in sorting between them. And then there's a bit about kind of policy response, both what employers can do to increase opportunity and what policymakers can do. So I will talk a little bit about the middle part here, about earnings inequalities within the same employer. For the first part that looks at sorting, another item on my agenda is to extend this with more countries. So I have Sweden plus 3 countries in the application, but actually I've been joined by others who have similar data and who are interested in contributing. So hopefully there's a cross-country paper on the way with this. Okay, so what then about earnings inequalities by social background within employers? And here, so this is comparative work. I kind of started working with a team that looked at this independently. So the specification here is a little bit different. It's not a two-way fixed effects model. Instead, we use very detailed controls for observed education. And we measure your parental origin as social class. So that's occupational groups rather than parental earnings. But otherwise, it's relatively similar. And then we start with the kind of raw earnings gap by social class background. We add detailed controls for education. Then we add controls for fixed effects for occupation, for establishment, and for the combination of the interaction between occupation and establishment, which we call jobs. So first thing to note here, and this is, so I should say, this is joint work with Ari Hermansson and Martin in Oslo and Martin Halstein in Sweden. So at this point, it's a Norway-Sweden comparison, but hopefully with more countries in the future. The baseline differences here in pay, if you compare the upper service class, as we call it, and the unskilled manual class, that is about 27% in Sweden, 18% in Norway. So this is not accounting for any differences in education and occupation in wider careers. Educational controls take away about 2/3 of that. So we're down to net of detailed education differences by class origin that amount to 9% in Sweden, 5% in Norway. Once we control for establishment, that takes away more than half, and then occupations add a bit too. So this is just to kind of keep in mind that when we look at earnings differences by social origin within establishment and net of human capital controls, there isn't a whole lot of inequality left, right? And this is actually something I think we should see as good news. But this is showing you across the economy as a whole. So this gets back to your question, Maya, about what about private sector, public sector, different industries, etc. So we see that these gaps are much smaller in the public sector, and that means that in the private sector they're quite a bit larger. So in the private sector as a whole, we find kind of remaining class gaps of around up to 5 percentage points. Once we break this down by industry, actually in the finance industry, the remaining inequalities by class origin are quite staggering by comparison. So above 5% and even up towards 10% in some cases. So that's just to highlight that most of earnings inequality by class origin are explained by either where you work or your human capital, but there is at least a small residual there that's left to explain. So then, yeah, I'm good. The question is, what explains differences in pay within workplaces? And there are some prominent theories here about how your pay might depend on sort of social class dynamics or cultural dynamics that play out both between employers in the same workplace, but also both between employees in the same workplace, but also between employees and managers. So there's quite a lot of qualitative work in sociology looking at what we might term sort of elite cultural fit, where in certain elite firms or settings, these upper class signals, maybe certain ways of dressing, behaving, certain spare time interests and so on, they increase your perceived fit with your colleagues and managers, and they help you gain favors and get ahead even within the same workplace. So according to this hypothesis, we might expect that if you come from a higher class background, if either most of your co-workers come from the same background, or if your manager comes from the same background, that should help boost your earnings. We can't really distinguish this from another more benign explanation, which is that people who come from a similar culture, they are just more galvanized. This is something that helps cultivate loyalty to the firm and effort and so on, and actually makes workers more productive. So I kind of bundle those explanations as one, and being completely transparent about that we can't really say whether this is driven by actual productivity difference or some sort of nepotism. Another hypothesis that we might have is that there is competition within the same class. So say that these elite cultural signals matter. You come from a high status background, so does your manager. There's a limited number of promotions available every year. So if you are the only high class person in the workplace, you will have a higher probability of getting ahead than if there are many others like you with the same culture who are competing for the same promotion, let's say. So now we are back to, this is again Swedish administrative data, we're back to estimating two-way fixed effects. And this is showing you then net of individual workplace fixed effects. How do your earnings vary dependent both on your own origin and the origin of your coworkers and managers. So when I talk about service class here, I should say this is sort of upper white collar work, so either professionals or higher managers compared to everyone else. So first thing to note is that the coefficient on coming from a higher class background is actually negative, but this is holding everything else constant. So this is given that neither your manager nor any of your coworkers come from a higher class origin. You coming from a higher class origin is actually negative, and part of this might, of course, be due to selection. The proportion who come from a higher class origin is possibly related to earnings on average across all workers, regardless of background. And the proportion of managers who come from a higher class background is negatively related. So having a manager from a higher class background tends to depress your earnings. So what we're mainly interested in, however, is in these interactions. So in this case, we see that if you come from a higher class background, having co-workers from a higher class background, once we control for a set of like a basic kind of mincer set of human capital characteristics, having co-workers from the same high class background is actually negatively related to your earnings. Whereas having a higher proportion of manager from a higher class background is positively related to your earnings. So just to sum up, this suggests some evidence for this theory of elite cultural fit when it comes to the match between manager and working origin, but it suggests that among co-workers, co-workers from the same background compete for the same compensation and promotion, and having being high class and being surrounded by high class co-workers is not necessarily beneficial for your earnings. But this is very sort of early tentative work in progress, so I leave you with that caveat, and then I'm happy to open for questions.
Thank you. So now time for questions. So those online can use the raise hand function to pose your questions or paste your question to the chat, stating your name and affiliation when possible. First, I will take a question for the audience here, if any. Let's have mine. Is there anything on the chat? Okay, so I have a couple of
Yeah, right.
Let's go for it. Go for it. So first, I was wondering. I mean, it's connected to what you added, no? So we have two firms. They are both lawyers.
Yeah.
Right. One of them hires nebo babies, the other
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah.
So this inequality of opportunity, mobility, and so on has like two legs, no? One is the fairness, and the other is the efficiency.
Yeah.
I would like to see if after 5 years, how is the firm doing on average? I don't know if you can see that with your data. What does the literature says about that? I have two more questions. Can I go on?
Yeah.
And the other thing I was interested in was if there are differences across the type of firm you have, because it's the skills you need to work in a lawyer's firm and consultancy, they are different if you want to work at the university. You're all very smart, maybe. So there are differences between cognitive, non-cognitive skills. How are they transmitted? I don't know. There's a way to check that to play that.
You said about 3 questions.
Yeah, I mixed 2 of them in.
Okay. Wait, so yeah, I get the first question. I didn't quite get your point about different skills, non-cognitive, cognitive. I mean, we do have data on that for men from the conscription, right? Quite detailed measures. I don't know what I would necessarily do with it, given that it's like point in time. So whatever that explains will be kind of soaked up by these individual level intercepts anyway.
So for instance, taking the acting thing, no, you were showing at the beginning with Jaden Smith and Will Smith. So is Jaden a good actor, or is he because he knows how to fit in Hollywood and or non-cognitive, or how he managed to work there?
Okay, so I think okay. So if there is nepotism, that it might be simply that kids inherit valuable skills from their parents, and using these social networks are an efficient way to screen for high quality workers from the employer's point of view. Okay, so let me start with that question. I think it's a good point. I mean, there are some theories about how this should affect pay differences over time, right? In the economics of discrimination, right? So there's this test specifically that if you think that pay differences are due to discrimination, you would expect them to be large at the point of hire and then smaller later on. So I'm not entirely convinced by that. It's something that I intend to look at. I'm not sure if we find that is the case, or if we find the reverse is the case, that it allows us to so clearly distinguish, because for the reason that a lot of these sociological theories are actually quite explicit that discrimination sort of happens both in hiring and promotion. But that wasn't exactly the point. So your point was about skills. And I think actually, so that's something that I've been intending to look at ever since we added this, which is just a throwaway finding in appendix, right? Which shows that being hired through contacts is associated with a higher correlation between your father's earnings and your individual rank. And I saw this first, I was like, oh, interesting. This is so this kind of clearly demonstrates that nepotism kind of causally benefits you. But then I thought a little bit harder, and I thought, okay, this could be exactly what you mentioned, that that employers use this network to actually screen for talent, and that is something that is correlated with your father's earnings. That's entirely valid. I think there is a way to get at it with longitudinal data. I haven't really thought about how, but I guess it goes in the same direction of saying, like, when are these differences the largest? Are they are they largest at the point of hire? Do they eventually converge or do they increase further? Maybe there's something we can do. I mean, we are able to measure skills, right? So I don't know if there's something there's probably something we can do there. So I'll think about that as well. Yeah, so something for me to think further about, and if you have any suggestions, I would love to hear them. About nepotism and productivity, yeah, I think that's actually is remarkable because I've been working on this paper for 5 years, and like every time I present it, I get a question, a lot of questions. I'm like, yeah, that is, appendix figure A75. But this is something that no one has asked me before. I think it's a good suggestion, and is definitely something that we can look at with the data. So I just add that to my to-do list. Thank you.
Sorry, we have nothing online?
Question online.
Okay, so then we can go online, Pedro? No? Okay, so sorry for the vague question.
Big question.
Vague question. But what do you think about the origin-specific role of the intensive and extensive margin, for example, unemployment, and their gender nature, for example, parenthood, for firm sorting and firm premiums? Is Adrian Greiner from the University of Bamberg.
So I'm not sure I follow. So intensive and extensive margin, that's basically getting at any employment at all versus the firm pay premium, or this was related to gender differences in the labor market?
And the gender nature, for instance, parenthood, I guess it's you work more or less depending on where you are, father or mother.
Right, okay. No, okay. So yeah, as I said, I mean, I've talked exclusively about men here, simply for the reason that the patterns are very similar for women, like the levels of these correlations, they tend to be gendered and so on, and like there's kind of a clear career break for women in the middle, but by the age of 40, that turns out not to matter that much. So just like in general terms, there isn't, what we do here, there isn't like a clear gender story. One thing that I would mention as a limitation is that we study exclusively annual earnings here. So yes, we're not able to disentangle, labor supply and wage. Does that matter for the estimation of these firm premiums? Maybe. That's a very big question that I haven't really seen someone address. It would be an interesting question if you had good data to do it, but it seems like a entire paper in its own, I think. So yeah, short answer, I don't have a good reply to that, how it would, if it matters and how it would affect our estimates, but we don't find any clear differences by gender is what I can say.
If you have the whole trajectory of the children's kind of work life,
Yeah.
it could also be interesting to see, and then I think you kind of went to that direction before with the question, like the probability of entering a Q4 firm, for example, as a first job, right? And then to see how that relates to this kind of stickiness throughout the life cycle, because we can think that somebody that enters a very high firm will very much likely stay in those quarters, where people will not move upwards that easily. And then if your first job depends on where your parents work.
Absolutely. I think that's a very good point. I think it's sort of consistent with my understanding of how this, as I would like to call them, stepping stone jobs might work. That you get like a kind of not very qualified but high pay gig with the help of your parents early in the career. Maybe you're already still studying, and that sets your reference point, right? Now you have that as your reservation wage, which you bring with you into any negotiation with a new employer and so on. I think I'm just taking suggestions. I think it's a great suggestion to look at, specifically the development of firm premiums and the stickiness of firm premiums, as you say. So I don't have any analysis speaking to that. So this is excellent. I'm getting ideas for new papers. But what I would highlight is that these social contacts and the relationship to the skill premium, the use of social contacts tend to happen quite early in the career, and these jobs tend to be short-lived. So I see this as sort of a stepping stone mechanism, which I think is very consistent with what you hint at, but the next step is to like actually use the longitudinal data, study that in detail as a separate paper. So I'm very grateful for that. I will.
Very short time, so if you can make it short, George.
Yeah, I can make it very short,
Yeah.
and I don't know whether it is a relevant question. But I want to see what is the impact of the social context in which this data is like, parents having a better income, therefore children have the access to jobs. So for example, what I mean is like a social context, I mean, is the influence of a patriarchal society.
Yeah.
With that, how does that influence, let's say, who are given jobs, men, women, or let's say caste society as in India, where the whole tradition of Brahmins getting or upper caste
Yeah.
people getting jobs. So the parents' income plays less or will play into the context that is in existence there.
Yeah, so Sweden, as you know, is known as a quite equal country, and I think we should interpret these results in light of that fact. So like a lot of what I say, I see maybe Sweden as kind of a lower bound case, if anything. We expect perhaps social context to matter more in a different setting, and especially I would say that holds for social context, but I would say it especially holds for these class signals. We are kind of a country of engineers. We don't really have any culture. We don't have this type of elite culture, at least to the same extent as certainly the UK or France or a lot of other European countries, and certainly, of course, nothing near the case of India and caste stratification. Yeah, so I would say Sweden is probably like any type of inequality you want to study. Sweden is probably lower bound. There's a really great paper by, I think his name is Sumitra Shukla, that studies case discrimination in hiring in India, in a large international firm in India, and shows that there's a huge gap by case that occurs at the interview stage, which is when we would expect these signals to come into play. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks so much, Per, for
Thank you.
this great seminar. Thanks so much for the audience. So see you next week. Next week we have Amaya, so I hope you are preparing your very tough and nasty questions for them. See you guys.